The wind carried the scent of dust and olive trees across the hills outside Jerusalem. Somewhere beyond the city walls, a watchman looked toward the horizon, searching for movement in the fading light. The streets behind him were still crowded. Merchants packed away their goods. Pilgrims whispered evening prayers. Children chased one another through narrow stone alleys, unaware that the world around them was quietly changing. No one could know that within a few years, the struggle for this city would draw kings across continents, empty royal treasuries, exhaust thousands of soldiers, and create one of the most famous rivalries in medieval history. It is tempting to remember the Third Crusade as a simple contest between two legendary men, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. One is often imagined as the fearless Christian king with a sword always in hand. The other appears as the noble Muslim sultan, wise and generous even in victory. Yet history has a habit of smoothing rough edges until people become symbols instead of human beings. The truth was far more complicated. Neither man truly wanted the world they inherited. Both stepped into a conflict shaped by decades of fear, ambition, faith, politics, and misunderstanding. By the time they finally faced one another, the story had already been unfolding for nearly a century. And that is where our journey begins. Welcome back, and thank you for choosing to spend a quiet part of your evening exploring another path through history. If these peaceful journeys into the past help you relax, consider supporting the channel by liking the video and subscribing. And if you feel comfortable, share where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. There is something quietly reassuring about imagining listeners scattered across the world, connected for a little while by the same story beneath different night skies. Now, settle into a comfortable place. Let your breathing become slow and easy. Allow the sounds around you to soften into the background. Tonight, we are traveling to the medieval world, where faith inspired incredible devotion, kingdoms rose and fell with astonishing speed, and one city stood at the center of hopes shared by millions. Jerusalem was unlike any other place on earth. To Christians, it was the city where Jesus had been crucified and resurrected. To Muslims, it was the place from which the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was believed to have ascended during the night journey. For Jewish communities, it remained the ancient heart of their history and faith. Three great religions looked toward the same hills. That alone made Jerusalem extraordinary. Yet religion was only part of its importance. The city lay at the meeting point of trade routes connecting Egypt, Syria, Arabia, and the Mediterranean coast. Caravans carried spices, silk, glassware, perfumes, precious metals, manuscripts, and stories from distant lands. Whoever ruled Jerusalem also held influence over roads that linked continents. Stone walls surrounded the city, but beyond them stretched a landscape of valleys, rocky hills, vineyards, and olive groves. Travelers approaching Jerusalem often described the golden color of its buildings glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Bells echoed from churches while the call to prayer drifted through the air from mosques. The city was alive with languages, traditions, and cultures that had mingled for centuries. Yet beneath its beauty rested constant uncertainty. For generations, empires had fought over these sacred lands. Romans, Byzantines, Persians, Arab caliphates, and countless local rulers had all claimed authority here. Every victory seemed permanent until another army appeared on the horizon. History rarely stays still. To understand why the Third Crusade became inevitable, we need to step back nearly 100 years before Richard the Lionheart ever boarded a ship for the Holy Land. In the late 11th century, Europe looked very different from the world we know today. There was no unified France, Germany, or Italy. Instead, power was divided among kings, dukes, counts, bishops, and ambitious nobles who constantly competed with one another. Castles overlooked forests and rivers. Villages clustered around churches. Roads were often muddy, dangerous, and slow to travel. Life for ordinary people revolved around the changing seasons. Spring brought planting. Summer demanded endless labor beneath the sun. Autumn meant harvest. Winter tested everyone. Most families never traveled farther than a few miles from home. News arrived slowly, carried by merchants, wandering monks, or weary travelers whose stories grew larger with every retelling. Faith shaped daily life. Church bells marked the passing hours. Festivals followed the Christian calendar. Pilgrimages to holy places were considered acts of devotion capable of bringing forgiveness and spiritual comfort. Jerusalem stood above every other destination. Many dreamed of seeing the Holy Sepulchre at least once before they died. But the journey was dangerous. Bandits haunted lonely roads. Storms threatened ships crossing the Mediterranean. Disease followed crowded ports. A pilgrimage could take months or even years. Still, thousands attempted it. Meanwhile, the Islamic world stretched across an enormous territory. Although often spoken of as a single civilization, it was far from united. Different dynasties governed different regions. Local rulers pursued their own ambitions. Political rivalries existed alongside remarkable achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, philosophy, and trade. Cities such as Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and Aleppo flourished as centers of learning and commerce. Libraries preserved ancient knowledge while scholars debated ideas beneath shaded courtyards. Markets overflowed with fabrics, spices, ceramics, and books copied carefully by hand. The medieval Mediterranean was not simply divided into two hostile worlds. Trade continued. Ideas crossed borders. Diplomats negotiated. Travelers exchanged stories. Conflict existed, but so did cooperation. This complexity is often forgotten. Then came the First Crusade. In 1095, Pope Urban II called upon the nobles of Western Europe to undertake an armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land. His speech has survived in several versions, each written after the event, so historians cannot be entirely certain of his exact words. But the message inspired thousands. Knights stitched crosses onto their clothing. Farmers sold what little they owned. Entire families joined the long journey eastward. Some hoped for spiritual salvation. Others sought adventure, wealth, land, or prestige. Many probably carried several motivations at once. The road ahead was unimaginably difficult. Long columns of travelers crossed mountains, rivers, and unfamiliar kingdoms. Hunger accompanied them. Illness spread quickly through crowded camps. Horses died. Supplies vanished. Arguments broke out between leaders whose pride often proved as dangerous as any enemy. Yet somehow they continued. Against remarkable odds, the crusading armies captured Jerusalem in 1099. What followed remains one of the darkest moments in the city's history. Contemporary sources describe widespread killing after the city's capture. The exact numbers remain debated, and medieval chroniclers frequently exaggerated victories or losses. Even so, there is little doubt that many inhabitants suffered terribly. For those inside the city, victory for one army became catastrophe for another. History remembers triumphs. Ordinary people remembered survival. After the conquest, new crusader states emerged across the eastern Mediterranean. Among them stood the Kingdom of Jerusalem. European nobles became rulers in lands thousands of miles from their homes. Massive castles rose atop hills overlooking roads and valleys. Stone fortresses guarded rivers and mountain passes. Pilgrims again traveled to holy places under Christian protection. For nearly 90 years, these kingdoms survived. Sometimes they fought neighboring Muslim rulers. Sometimes they made peace. Sometimes they traded goods across borders. The frontier remained surprisingly fluid. A knight who fought one rival this year might negotiate with him the next. Life continued between wars. Farmers cultivated wheat and olives. Merchants counted coins in crowded marketplaces. Children grew up speaking multiple languages. Communities adapted to a world where cultures met every day. But beneath this fragile balance, something larger was beginning to move. The Muslim world, long divided among competing leaders, slowly found a new source of unity. That source was not immediate. It emerged through decades of careful politics, military campaigns, alliances, and religious determination. At the center of this transformation stood a man who would become one of history's most respected commanders. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Today, the world knows him simply as Saladin. He was not born into greatness. Around 1137 or 1138, Saladin entered the world in Tikrit, a town along the Tigris River in what is now Iraq. His Kurdish family served powerful rulers, but they were hardly masters of vast empires. According to later traditions, the family left Tikrit shortly after his birth under difficult circumstances, beginning a journey that would eventually bring them to Syria. As a young man, Saladin did not appear destined to become one of history's greatest military leaders. He enjoyed poetry. He appreciated scholarship. He studied religion. Those who knew him early in life sometimes described him as thoughtful rather than fierce. History often surprises us this way. The people remembered as legendary warriors rarely spend every moment preparing for battle. Life changes them. So do opportunities. So do crises. Saladin entered military service under the guidance of his uncle, Shirkuh, a skilled commander serving Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Syria. Political struggles in Egypt soon drew them southward, where rival factions competed for control of one of the richest lands in the region. What seemed at first like another complicated political mission slowly transformed Saladin's future. And eventually, it would transform the future of Jerusalem itself. But that part of the story was still waiting. For now, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem continued to stand beneath its bright skies and ancient walls, unaware that the balance which had endured for nearly a century was beginning to shift. The first signs were almost invisible. The consequences would reshape the medieval world. Morning arrived slowly over the eastern Mediterranean. The first light touched the stone towers of Crusader castles perched above lonely hills. Fishing boats drifted away from quiet harbors as gulls circled overhead. In villages scattered across the countryside, bakers lit their ovens while farmers led donkeys toward fields that had been cultivated for generations. It looked like another ordinary day. But history often changes long before ordinary people notice. The kingdom of Jerusalem still appeared strong from the outside. Its walls stood firm. Pilgrims continued to arrive from Europe. Merchants filled the markets with spices from Arabia, silk from the East, Venetian glass, olive oil, and fine cloth. Noble families held feasts inside fortified castles, believing that the Christian kingdoms established after the First Crusade would continue for generations. Appearances, however, can be misleading. The Crusader states had never been especially large. Their survival depended on careful diplomacy, strong fortifications, reliable supplies from Europe, and alliances that were often fragile. They existed like islands surrounded by powerful neighbors. As long as those neighbors remained divided, the balance could be maintained. But that balance was beginning to disappear. Saladin's rise was not simply the story of one remarkable commander. It was the story of patience. Serving under Nur ad-Din, he learned that lasting victories were rarely won by courage alone. Armies needed food, horses, money, loyal officers, and above all, time. Kingdoms could collapse from poor decisions just as easily as from lost battles. When his uncle Shirkuh died in Egypt in 1169, Saladin unexpectedly found himself appointed vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate. Many doubted him. He was relatively young. He came from a Kurdish military family rather than Egypt's ruling elite. Powerful courtiers believed they could control him. They were mistaken. Quietly, year after year, Saladin strengthened his position. He reorganized the government, improved the army, rewarded loyal followers, and reduced the influence of rivals. Rather than seeking immediate glory, he built stability. That mattered. Because stable governments can prepare for struggles that unstable ones cannot. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, another opportunity appeared. Syria itself became divided by competing claimants, ambitious governors, and uncertain alliances. Saladin moved carefully, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through military pressure, gradually bringing Egypt and much of Syria under his leadership. It was an extraordinary achievement. For the first time in decades, many Muslim territories surrounding the Crusader states were moving toward political unity. The frontier was changing. And although not everyone welcomed Saladin's growing power, many respected his reputation for discipline, justice, and religious devotion. Even his enemies would later acknowledge these qualities. That did not mean he was gentle. He fought hard campaigns. Cities resisted him. Soldiers died in great numbers. Like every ruler of his age, he understood that power often depended upon force. History has a habit of remembering leaders in simple colors. Reality is rarely so simple. Saladin could show mercy. He could also wage relentless war. Both things were true. While these changes unfolded across Egypt and Syria, life inside the Kingdom of Jerusalem became increasingly uncertain. The kingdom faced a problem shared by many medieval states. Its rulers changed. Some kings died young. Others became seriously ill. Noble families argued over succession. Powerful lords competed for influence around the royal court. These disputes were not merely personal. Every disagreement weakened the kingdom's ability to respond to dangers beyond its borders. One of the most remarkable rulers during this period was Baldwin IV. He became king while still a boy. But unlike most young kings, Baldwin carried an invisible burden. He suffered from leprosy. Today, we understand leprosy far better than medieval people did. At the time, however, the disease inspired fear and uncertainty. Gradually, Baldwin lost feeling in his hands and feet. His body weakened over the years, even while his responsibilities grew heavier. Yet he refused to surrender to illness. Again and again, Baldwin appeared on campaign, leading armies despite increasing physical pain. Contemporary accounts describe servants helping him mount his horse because he could no longer do so alone. Imagine the determination that required. A king whose own body was slowly failing still rode into battle because his kingdom depended upon him. He was not simply fighting enemies. He was racing against time. For a while, Baldwin's leadership preserved the fragile peace. Victories such as the Battle of Montcassard in 1177 demonstrated that the Crusader kingdom remained capable of defeating even Saladin under the right circumstances. It surprised many observers. Saladin himself learned valuable lessons from that defeat. He became even more cautious. Even more patient. Instead of risking everything on one battle, he focused on strengthening his resources and waiting for better opportunities. Sometimes restraint is more dangerous than aggression. Years passed. Baldwin's health continued to decline. Questions about who would inherit the throne became increasingly urgent. Courtiers whispered in palace corridors illuminated by candlelight. Letters crossed the Mediterranean seeking support. Marriage alliances were negotiated. Old rivalries deepened. The kingdom still possessed impressive castles, disciplined knights, and wealthy ports. But inside its political heart, uncertainty continued to spread. Meanwhile, another figure entered the story. His name was Reynold of Chatillon. Few personalities of the Crusader period remain as controversial. Reynold had spent years as a prisoner after being captured in battle. His long captivity hardened him. When he finally returned to power, he pursued an aggressive policy toward Muslim territories, often acting independently of the kingdom's leadership. According to contemporary accounts, Reynold organized raids against caravans traveling under agreements that many believed should have been respected. Some reports even suggest he dreamed of attacking the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, though historians continue to debate how realistic those plans truly were. Whether all the stories are completely accurate or not, one fact is clear. Reynold became a constant source of tension. Each raid threatened fragile truces. Each attack increased pressure on Saladin to respond. For ordinary merchants, these raids meant fear. A caravan crossing the desert carried more than expensive goods. It carried families hoping to earn a living. Drivers responsible for hundreds of camels. Guards protecting travelers. Scholars carrying books. Pilgrims making sacred journeys. When caravans were attacked, it was not only politics that suffered. Entire communities paid the price. Saladin repeatedly demanded compensation and the release of prisoners. His requests were rejected. Little by little, peaceful solutions became harder to imagine. And beneath these diplomatic failures, something much larger was beginning to move. By the mid-1180s, Baldwin IV had died. His young successor, Baldwin V, survived only a short time before passing away as well. Another succession crisis followed. Eventually, Guy of Lusignan became king through his marriage to Queen Sibylla. Not everyone supported him. Several powerful nobles questioned his experience and judgment. The kingdom entered one of the most dangerous moments in its history. Not because it lacked brave knights. Because it lacked unity. History often turns on that difference. Saladin watched carefully. He understood that divided enemies could become vulnerable. Yet even then, he did not rush blindly into war. He gathered forces from across his territories. Egyptian soldiers marched north. Syrian cavalry assembled. Volunteers answered religious calls to defend Jerusalem. Supply wagons carried grain, arrows, tents, and water skins across dusty roads. Blacksmiths repaired armor. Horse trainers prepared mounts for long campaigns. Months of preparation unfolded before the great confrontation. War was not simply a matter of battles. It was an enormous exercise in organization. Thousands of people who would never swing a sword still determined whether army survived. A forgotten baker might matter as much as a famous knight. A reliable water source could prove more valuable than courage. A single delayed shipment might change an entire campaign. These quieter parts of history are easy to overlook. Yet they often decide everything. In the summer of 1187, the tension finally reached its breaking point. Saladin assembled one of the largest armies the region had seen in many years. His objective was clear. He intended to force the Crusader army into a decisive confrontation. The Christian leadership faced a difficult choice. Remain near reliable water and strong fortifications. Or march into the heat to relieve the city of Tiberias, which Saladin had placed under siege. Opinions differed sharply. Some experienced commanders urged caution. Others believed honor demanded immediate action. King Guy ultimately chose to march. At first, the decision may not have seemed unreasonable. But history would remember it very differently. The summer sun showed no mercy. Heavy armor trapped heat. Water supplies dwindled. Dust filled the air with every step. Men who had trained for combat now struggled simply to keep moving. Horses became exhausted. Thirst spread through the ranks. Saladin's forces avoided unnecessary risks. Instead, they harassed the advancing Crusaders, preventing easy access to water while carefully choosing the ground on which the final battle would occur. The danger was not where most expected it to be. It was the landscape itself. The hills known as the Horns of Hattin waited ahead. There, beneath a burning July sky, two armies would meet in one of the most decisive battles of the medieval world. And before another sunset had passed, the road to Jerusalem would lie almost completely open. The dawn of July 4, 1187, arrived without relief. The first rays of sunlight spread across the dry hills near the Horns of Hattin, but the coolness of the night had already begun to disappear. A light breeze stirred the dust, carrying with it the smell of scorched grass, tired horses, and smoke from distant campfires. Thousands of men stood awake long before sunrise, knowing that this day would decide far more than a single battle. Many of them had barely slept. The Crusader army had spent the previous day marching through unbearable heat. Their water supplies had almost vanished. Armor that normally inspired confidence now trapped the rising warmth against their bodies. Lips cracked from thirst. Horses stumbled from exhaustion. Every step required more effort than the last. Some soldiers quietly prayed. Others simply stared toward the horizon. No one could know exactly how the day would end, but many already sensed that something had gone terribly wrong. Saladin, meanwhile, had chosen his battlefield with remarkable care. He understood that victory did not always belong to the larger army or the stronger warriors. Sometimes it belonged to the commander who understood the land itself. His forces surrounded the Crusaders from several directions while remaining close to reliable sources of water. Mounted archers moved constantly across the hills, never allowing the exhausted Christian army a moment to recover. Every attempt to break through met another shower of arrows. It was a lesson in patience. Saladin resisted the temptation to rush into one massive attack. Instead, he allowed thirst, fatigue, confusion, and the burning summer sun to become his allies. History is often shaped by generals. Sometimes it is shaped by the weather. As the morning grew hotter, another terrible problem emerged. According to several medieval accounts, fires spread through the dry grass around the Crusader position. Whether every detail happened exactly as later chroniclers described remains uncertain, but many sources agree that smoke drifted toward the exhausted soldiers, making an already desperate situation even worse. Visibility decreased. Breathing became harder. The air itself seemed to turn against them. Within the Christian ranks, discipline slowly began to weaken. Groups of knights attempted desperate charges downhill, hoping to reach water before they collapsed. Some fought with extraordinary courage, breaking through enemy lines for a brief moment before finding themselves isolated and surrounded. Others never reached the springs at all. For ordinary foot soldiers, the situation was even more hopeless. Unlike mounted knights, they could not easily escape the encirclement. Heavy shields grew almost impossible to carry beneath the crushing heat. Many had not tasted fresh water in nearly 2 days. Imagine standing beneath that relentless sun. Your throat burns. Your armor feels heavier with every passing hour. Dust fills your mouth. You hear commands, prayers, cries for help, and the constant whistle of arrows, yet all you can think about is a single cup of water. History often remembers famous commanders. The people who endured these moments rarely receive the same attention. By midday, the battle had become a disaster for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. King Guy of Lusignan fought alongside his remaining followers, but the army could no longer function as a united force. One position after another collapsed. The famous relic known as the True Cross, carried into battle as a symbol of faith and hope, was captured. For many Christians, its loss carried enormous emotional weight. It felt as though something far greater than a military defeat had occurred. It felt as though heaven itself had turned silent. Saladin's victory was complete. Many important nobles were taken prisoner. Others died where they stood. Among those captured was King Guy himself. Also captured was Reynold of Chatillon. The fate of these two men would soon become one of the most discussed moments of the entire campaign. According to several contemporary Muslim and Christian sources, Saladin received the prisoners inside his tent after the battle. King Guy, exhausted and suffering from thirst, was offered a drink of cool water. It was a gesture that reflected traditions of hospitality. Guy accepted it gratefully. He then passed the cup to Reynold. Saladin reportedly interrupted. He explained that he had offered water only to the king, not to Reynold. Whether every word was recorded exactly as spoken is impossible to know. Medieval chroniclers often shaped conversations to reflect moral lessons. Yet the broader story appears consistently across several accounts. Saladin accused Reynold of repeatedly breaking truces, attacking caravans, and violating sworn agreements. He offered Reynold the opportunity to embrace Islam. Reynold refused. Saladin then personally struck him before guards completed the execution. King Guy feared that he would suffer the same fate. Instead, Saladin reportedly reassured him. "A king does not kill a king." Whether those precise words were spoken remains uncertain. But King Guy's life was spared. This contrast became part of Saladin's reputation throughout both the Islamic world and Christian Europe. He could be uncompromising. He could also show restraint. Both qualities shaped the image that later generations remembered. The victory at Hattin changed everything. The Crusader army had not merely lost a battle. It had lost much of its experienced leadership. Its military strength had been shattered in a single campaign. One by one, towns and castles across the Kingdom of Jerusalem began to surrender. Many lacked enough defenders. Others realized that resistance would only bring greater suffering. Saladin moved steadily across the region, accepting submissions where possible and laying siege where necessary. For ordinary families, these weeks were filled with uncertainty. Farmers abandoned fields before harvest. Merchants hid valuable goods beneath stone floors. Children watched unfamiliar banners appear above city walls. No one knew what tomorrow would bring. And then the road led toward Jerusalem itself. Nearly 90 years had passed since the First Crusade captured the city. Now another great siege was about to begin. Inside Jerusalem, fear spread quickly. The city no longer possessed the large army needed to defend itself. Many experienced knights had died or been captured at Hattin. Thousands of refugees crowded within the walls after fleeing surrounding towns and villages. Food supplies suddenly seemed much smaller. Every loaf of bread mattered. Every barrel of water became precious. Every rumor traveled through the streets faster than the last. Leadership now fell largely to Balian of Ibelin. His story remains one of quiet courage. Originally, Balian had received permission from Saladin to enter Jerusalem only long enough to escort his family safely away. According to later accounts, the city's desperate inhabitants begged him to remain and organize the defense. Doing so meant breaking his promise. It was not a decision he made lightly. Saladin himself reportedly released Balian from his oath after learning of the circumstances. Whether every detail unfolded exactly this way continues to be discussed by historians. What seems clear is that mutual respect existed between the two men despite the conflict surrounding them. Jerusalem prepared for siege. Walls were repaired. Weapons were distributed. Even boys too young for battle helped carry stones and supplies. Priests led prayers through crowded churches. Mothers comforted frightened children as the sound of distant military camps echoed beyond the walls. Outside, Saladin assembled his forces. The city that had remained at the center of dreams, prayers, and wars for centuries stood before him. Its golden stones reflected the autumn sunlight just as they had for countless generations. Yet this siege would not resemble the terrible events of 1099. Both sides remembered that earlier conquest. Its memory remained painful. Saladin understood that taking Jerusalem by storm could lead to terrible bloodshed. The defenders understood that prolonged resistance might produce the same result. Negotiations began alongside military operations. Days passed. Attacks continued. Sections of the walls weakened. The defenders fought with determination despite overwhelming odds. Eventually, Balian recognized the unavoidable truth. Jerusalem could not be held forever. He entered negotiations with Saladin once again. The agreement they reached became one of the most significant moments of medieval history. Instead of ordering a massacre similar to the one that had followed the First Crusade, Saladin allowed many inhabitants to ransom themselves and leave peacefully. Not everyone could afford the required payment. Many poorer families faced uncertainty. Yet contemporary sources also describe Saladin and several of his commanders freeing numerous captives without payment, while others contributed money to help strangers purchase their freedom. The reality remained difficult. Families still left homes they had known for years. Many possessions were abandoned. Long lines of refugees departed beneath the watch of victorious soldiers. There was sorrow. There was relief. There was exhaustion. History rarely offers endings that are entirely joyful or entirely tragic. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem formally surrendered. For Muslims across the region, it was a moment of profound religious and political significance. For Christian Europe, it came as a devastating shock. Church bells rang with sorrow across distant kingdoms. Messengers carried the astonishing news from port to port. Kings, bishops, merchants, monks, and ordinary villagers all heard the same unbelievable report. Jerusalem had fallen. The city that had stood at the heart of the Crusader kingdom for nearly 90 years was no longer under Christian rule. Across Europe, people struggled to believe it. But the greatest consequences were still to come. Because the loss of Jerusalem would awaken three of the most powerful rulers in Christendom. Soon, armies unlike any seen in generations would begin gathering. One emperor would never reach the Holy Land. One king would become Richard the Lionheart. And across the sea, Saladin would soon discover that winning Jerusalem had begun a far greater struggle than the one he had just finished. News of Jerusalem's fall traveled across Europe with astonishing speed. It did not move as we think of news today. There were no newspapers waiting on doorsteps, no printed bulletins, no voices carried instantly across oceans. Instead, the message passed from ship to harbor, from monastery to village, from royal court to cathedral. A merchant arriving in an Italian port would tell the story to local officials. A bishop would repeat it during a gathering of clergy. A traveler would carry it across mountain roads into another kingdom, where the tale would be told once again. With every retelling, the emotion grew heavier. For many Christians, the loss of Jerusalem felt almost unimaginable. It was not simply the defeat of an army or the fall of a distant city. It was the loss of one of the holiest places in their faith, a place that countless pilgrims had dreamed of reaching throughout their lives. Church bells rang in mourning. Special prayers were offered. Kings who had spent years arguing over borders and inheritance suddenly found themselves facing a challenge that seemed larger than any of their personal rivalries. The shock reached Rome as well. Pope Urban III is said to have been deeply affected by the reports of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem. According to later accounts, the news contributed to his final illness, though historians cannot say with certainty how much truth lies behind that tradition. What is clear is that the papacy quickly recognized the moment as one of extraordinary importance. A new crusade was proclaimed. It would become known as the Third Crusade. Unlike earlier expeditions led mainly by powerful nobles, this campaign would draw some of the greatest monarchs in Europe. Their names would echo through history for centuries. But before they ever reached the shores of the Holy Land, each carried ambitions, fears, and responsibilities that stretched far beyond Jerusalem itself. And this is where the story becomes even more human. The first of these rulers was Frederick I, better known as Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. By the late 1180s, Barbarossa was already an aging ruler, respected across Europe for his experience and determination. His nickname, Redbeard, had become almost legendary during his lifetime. Unlike younger kings eager to prove themselves, Frederick had spent decades navigating the complicated politics of the Holy Roman Empire. He understood that leading a crusade meant far more than gathering soldiers. It meant feeding them, paying them, keeping thousands of men united across lands where languages, customs, and loyalties constantly changed. His preparations were enormous. An army numbering perhaps tens of thousands began its long journey overland toward the eastern Mediterranean. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated military numbers, so historians continue to debate the exact size of the force. Whatever the precise figure, it was one of the largest armies Europe had assembled in generations. The march itself became an epic undertaking. Columns of infantry stretched across dusty roads. Knights rode beneath colorful banners that fluttered in the wind. Supply wagons creaked under the weight of grain, tools, tents, weapons, and barrels of water. Priests traveled alongside soldiers. Blacksmiths repaired damaged armor. Doctors carried herbs and simple medical instruments, hoping to treat wounds they knew would soon appear. For ordinary men, each sunrise brought another day of walking. Mountains had to be crossed. Rivers had to be forded. Foreign rulers had to be persuaded, or pressured, to allow safe passage. The journey was almost a campaign before the real campaign had even begun. Meanwhile, another king was making his own preparations. Philip II of France. Philip was very different from the image many people associate with medieval warrior kings. He was thoughtful, cautious, and politically skilled. He preferred careful planning to reckless displays of bravery. His kingdom was becoming stronger under his rule, and he understood that success depended not only upon victories in battle but also upon strengthening royal authority at home. Yet Philip also recognized that refusing the crusade could damage both his reputation and his standing among Europe's Christian rulers. So he committed himself to the expedition. Still, one name would eventually overshadow every other participant. Richard. The future Richard I of England. The man history would remember as Richard the Lionheart. But Richard's story did not begin with glory. He was born in 1157 into the powerful Angevin dynasty, a family whose territory stretched across England and large parts of western France. His father was Henry II, one of the most capable kings of the medieval world. His mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of history's most remarkable queens. Richard inherited extraordinary opportunities. He also inherited extraordinary problems. The Angevin family was rarely peaceful. Henry II's sons competed against one another for power and inheritance. Rebellions erupted within the royal family itself. Alliances shifted with bewildering speed. Richard grew up in a world where political survival often depended upon defeating one's own relatives. It was not an easy childhood. Nor was he a simple man. Later generations remembered Richard almost entirely as a fearless warrior. There is truth in that image. He possessed remarkable courage. He excelled in military leadership. He inspired fierce loyalty among many of his followers. Yet he also loved music. He composed poetry. He appreciated courtly culture. He spoke French far more comfortably than English and spent surprisingly little time in England throughout his life. History has flattened him into a knight holding a sword. The Real Richard was considerably more complicated. He could be generous. He could be impatient. He could forgive one rival while treating another with extraordinary severity. Like Saladin, he lived within contradictions. By the time Jerusalem fell, Richard had only recently become King of England following the death of his father. His reign had scarcely begun before the crusade demanded his attention. Preparing for such an expedition required astonishing amounts of money. Castles needed garrisons while the king was away. Ships had to be built or hired. Weapons purchased. Food gathered. Thousands of men equipped. Richard sold offices, lands, and royal privileges to raise the necessary funds. One famous remark, perhaps exaggerated by later writers, claimed that he would have sold London itself if only he could find a buyer. Whether those exact words were spoken hardly matters. They capture an important truth. Richard intended to spare no expense. The crusade became the defining purpose of the opening years of his reign. Yet before any of these kings reached the Holy Land, the crusade would suffer its first great tragedy. Frederick Barbarossa's army continued its difficult march across Anatolia. Despite hardships, it achieved impressive progress. Many observers believed the emperor's experienced leadership might become the decisive factor in recovering Jerusalem. Then, in June 1190, disaster struck. While crossing the Salef River in what is now southern Turkey, Frederick drowned. The precise circumstances remain uncertain. Some accounts suggest he attempted to swim. Others describe his horse slipping beneath him during the crossing. Whatever happened, the result shocked Europe. One moment, the crusade possessed its most experienced commander. The next, he was gone. An army can survive hunger. It can survive defeat. Sometimes it cannot survive the sudden loss of its leader. Frederick's death devastated morale. Many soldiers abandoned the expedition and returned home. Others pressed onward, determined to honor the emperor's memory. But the great overland army would never recover its original strength. History often turns on moments that seem almost impossible. A mighty emperor survived decades of war and politics. A river ended his journey. Meanwhile, Richard and Philip prepared to travel by sea. Their fleets gathered in busy ports where carpenters hammered planks into place and sailors loaded endless supplies aboard waiting ships. The smell of saltwater mixed with fresh timber, tar, rope, and livestock. Crusaders embraced their families. Some expected to return within a few years. Many never would. The Mediterranean stretched before them, beautiful and uncertain. Storms could destroy entire fleets. Disease spread easily aboard crowded vessels. Pirates still haunted certain waters. Even reaching the Holy Land remained a dangerous achievement. Yet thousands willingly accepted the risk. Because they believed history was calling them. And far to the east, Saladin watched these developments with careful attention. He had reclaimed Jerusalem. But he understood something many celebrations overlooked. Winning a city and keeping it were not the same thing. Across Europe, 3 kings had answered the call. Soon, the greatest crusading army of the age would begin arriving on the shores of the Levant. The struggle between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the rivalry that would become the heart of medieval legend, was finally about to begin. But that is a story for the next part of our journey, where castles, sieges, diplomacy, and unforgettable battles would test 2 of history's most extraordinary leaders in ways neither could fully foresee. The sea was calm when the first sails appeared on the horizon. From the walls of the coastal cities of the Levant, watchmen scanned the endless blue water each morning. At first, they saw only scattered merchant vessels moving between familiar ports. Then the number of ships began to grow. White sails filled the distance like drifting clouds, carrying thousands of men from kingdoms hundreds and even thousands of miles away. The Third Crusade had truly begun. For the people living along the eastern Mediterranean coast, this was not an abstract event discussed in distant royal courts. It arrived with the tide. Harbors became crowded with soldiers speaking different languages. Blacksmiths worked from sunrise until long after dark, repairing helmets, sharpening swords, and fitting horseshoes. Bakers struggled to produce enough bread for armies that seemed to grow larger each week. Wells emptied more quickly than anyone expected. Every sack of grain, every barrel of wine, every bundle of firewood suddenly became precious. War reshaped ordinary life long before the first battle was fought. Richard of England and Philip of France did not travel together in perfect harmony. Although they had sworn to undertake the crusade, they remained rivals as much as allies. Medieval kings rarely forgot their political ambitions simply because they shared a religious cause. Questions of prestige, territory, inheritance, and personal honor followed them wherever they went. The crusade united Europe. But only to a point. Even before reaching the Holy Land, disagreements emerged over leadership and influence. Courtiers whispered inside richly decorated tents. Messengers rode between camps carrying carefully worded letters. Every public gesture was observed. Who stood closest to the king? Whose banner flew higher? Who would command when the armies finally met the enemy? These details may seem small. They were not. In the medieval world, symbols carried tremendous weight. Meanwhile, Richard's journey was interrupted by an unexpected episode that revealed much about his personality. Storms scattered parts of his fleet across the Mediterranean. Several ships were driven toward the island of Cyprus, then ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine noble who had declared himself independent. Instead of welcoming the stranded crusaders, Isaac seized ships, imprisoned survivors, and refused Richard's demands for compensation. It was a costly mistake. Richard reacted with extraordinary speed. Within weeks, he launched a campaign against Cyprus itself. His soldiers came ashore under the bright Mediterranean sun while armored knights advanced inland through vineyards, rocky hills, and villages surrounded by olive trees. Isaac's forces resisted, but they could not match Richard's determination. Town after town surrendered. Before long, the entire island had fallen into Crusader hands. For Richard, this was more than revenge. Cyprus occupied a strategic position in the eastern Mediterranean. Its ports offered secure bases for ships carrying food, weapons, horses, and reinforcements to the Holy Land. Without realizing it fully, Richard had acquired one of the most valuable possessions of the entire crusade. History sometimes rewards decisions made for immediate reasons with consequences that last generations. During his stay on Cyprus, another important event quietly unfolded. Richard married Berengaria of Navarre. The wedding took place far from England, surrounded not by familiar castles but by the warm sea air of the Mediterranean. Even amid preparations for war, life continued. Kings married. Children were born. Merchants opened their shops. Farmers harvested grain. History is never made only on battlefields. Soon afterward, Richard sailed east once more. His destination was Acre. By the time he arrived in June 1191, the city had already endured one of the longest and most exhausting sieges of the medieval period. To understand why Acre mattered so much, we must step back a little. After the disaster at Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem, many surviving crusaders had gathered around Acre, one of the most important ports in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Rather than surrender, they decided to besiege the city, hoping to recover at least one major stronghold before attempting anything larger. The situation became extraordinary. Crusaders surrounded Acre. Saladin's army surrounded the Crusaders. And inside the city, Muslim defenders resisted both. It was, in many ways, a siege within a siege. Imagine the confusion. Inside the walls, defenders rationed food while repairing damaged fortifications each night. Outside the walls, Crusader soldiers dug trenches, built siege towers, and launched repeated assaults. Beyond them stood Saladin's army, attempting to break the siege from the outside. Three great forces occupied the same narrow landscape. Every day brought fighting. Every night brought uncertainty. Months stretched into years. Disease spread through crowded camps. Poor sanitation contaminated water supplies. Flies gathered around wounded men lying beneath canvas shelters. Doctors did what they could with herbs, wine, vinegar, and simple surgical instruments. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they could only offer comfort. Not every death came from the sword. Indeed, many soldiers never reached a battlefield. Fever proved more deadly than steel. For ordinary crusaders, life during the siege became a cycle of waiting. Waiting for supplies. Waiting for reinforcements. Waiting for orders. Waiting for another assault. The monotony itself became exhausting. A man might spend an entire morning carrying stones for siege engines, only to spend the afternoon filling defensive trenches after enemy attacks. At sunset he would eat coarse bread, perhaps a little salted meat if supplies allowed, and then attempt to sleep while catapults hurled stones through the darkness. No one rested deeply. Inside Acre, conditions were hardly better. Food grew scarce. Fresh water became increasingly valuable. Families sheltered inside crowded buildings while stones crashed into rooftops. Children learned to recognize the sounds of different siege engines. Merchants who had once traded silk and spices now worried only about survival. Every sunrise raised the same question. How much longer? Saladin worked tirelessly to relieve the city. Again and again, his forces attacked the Crusader lines, searching for weak points. Sometimes they broke through briefly. Sometimes fierce fighting lasted from dawn until dusk without either side gaining much ground. Neither army lacked courage. Neither army lacked determination. The siege became a contest of endurance. And endurance often favors those who can continue supplying their soldiers. Richard's arrival transformed the balance. Although he had been delayed by events in Cyprus, he reached Acre with fresh troops, experienced commanders, powerful siege equipment, and renewed energy. Even before recovering from illness that had troubled him during the voyage, Richard involved himself in directing military operations. Contemporary accounts describe him continuing to oversee attacks despite suffering from fever. Whether every story about his personal bravery has been exaggerated by admirers is difficult to know. What seems beyond dispute is that Richard possessed remarkable determination. He refused to remain inactive. His presence inspired many crusaders who had begun losing hope after nearly 2 years of frustration. Philip II also contributed significantly to the siege. Although later legends often place Richard alone at the center of events, the French king played an essential role in organizing operations and maintaining pressure against the city. History sometimes remembers one hero while quietly overlooking another. The reality was more balanced. Together, their armies intensified bombardments. Great wooden trebuchets hurled enormous stones against Acre's walls. Engineers dug tunnels beneath defensive towers, hoping to collapse them. Archers filled the sky with arrows. Trumpets echoed across the battlefield. Clouds of dust rose above shattered masonry. Yet amid all this destruction, moments of ordinary humanity still appeared. Temporary truces occasionally allowed both sides to collect their dead. Prisoners exchanged news with relatives. Doctors treated wounded enemies alongside wounded friends. Even during bitter conflict, people remained people. By July 1191, Acre's defenders could no longer continue. After almost 2 years of resistance, negotiations began. The city agreed to surrender under carefully negotiated terms. The Crusaders entered Acre. Church bells rang once more. Banners bearing crosses rose above the battered walls. For many Christians, it felt like the first hopeful news since Jerusalem had fallen. Yet peace remained distant. One of the most painful episodes of the Third Crusade soon followed. The surrender agreement required the payment of ransom, the exchange of prisoners, and the return of the true cross. Delays and disagreements arose over fulfilling these conditions. Each side blamed the other. Trust, already fragile, began to disappear. Richard eventually ordered the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners held outside Acre. The exact reasons remain debated. Some historians argue that Richard believed Saladin had intentionally delayed the agreed exchanges. Others suggest he feared the logistical burden of guarding so many captives. Whatever his reasoning, the result was tragic. Saladin, witnessing what had happened, was deeply angered. The executions hardened attitudes on both sides. If there had still been hope for a quick negotiated settlement, it became far more difficult to imagine. History remembers Richard as a brilliant commander. It must also remember moments like this. Great leaders often leave behind complicated legacies. Courage and harshness can exist within the same person. Honor and cruelty sometimes appear in the same campaign. The medieval world was filled with such contradictions. As summer continued, another change quietly unfolded. Philip II, citing illness and pressing political concerns in France, decided to return home.